Hello and welcome to the Undressing the Spirit podcast, where sex and spirit go hand in hand. Join me, Tamara Powell, on a no-holds-barred adventure into the psyche and beyond every conceivable limit. Welcome to Volume 5 of the Cracked Open series on Undressing the Spirit. I'm your host, Tamara Powell, and I am once again joined by my co-host for this series, Alexandra Cavucci. Today, she and I are diving into the world of triggers. You can't help but have them if you're going to be a human being on this planet. So how come some people seem to get stuck and head down a nasty rabbit hole, while others seem to be able to flow with life circumstances? Today, Alex and I are unpacking some of our own personal journeys and sharing with you our struggles and our triumphs in learning to listen to our body and our emotions. So I invite you to pull up a comfy chair, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's dive right in. Welcome to the Cracked Open series. I'm Tamara Powell.
And I'm Alexandra Cavucci.
And we believe that we're all really just shells hoping to be chiseled open so we can see the universe within.
We hope to pave the way for you if you're looking for a place to be cracked open, unraveled, and join us on this journey.
So we'll show you ours if you'll show us yours. Hey, Alex.
Hello, I just took a sip of water at the wrong time. How are you?
Actually, that sounded kind of sexy.
I'll do every intro that way or every hello that way.
We are on Volume 5 today. Can you believe it?
Volume 5 already?
Already.
Goodness gracious. Though I have to admit, it does kind of feel like we've been doing this forever. So for all I know, this could be Volume 257 and it would feel just as right.
That's the plan. May it always stay this magical.
Yeah.
I was thinking this morning about how today's a new moon and we last met on my birthday, which is a full moon. So kind of funny that we're synced up on when we're podcasting.
Yeah. And, for the listeners, before we hopped on the recording, we recognized that for the last couple of weeks, we've been saying to each other when we meet up before recording, it's been a weird week. Has it been a weird week for you? And we recognize that it has been falling on the full moon, the new moon. And hopefully we can keep it that way so we can keep having some weird magic go on.
It's extra magical.
Yeah.
Which is the perfect segue for today's conversation because we're talking about triggers and right? Hits and all the feels.
Yeah. So I'm curious for our listeners, I remember the first time I heard that word, I was like, the hell is a trigger? What do you define a trigger as? What would you define a trigger as for the people listening who may not know or have experienced?
I look at it from a therapeutic standpoint. How could I not? Because I'm a licensed therapist. As in a stimuli that comes in and promotes an emotional or a behavioral response. Obviously both, right? Because the emotions then drive the behavioral response. So it can be anything. It could be the moon cycle. It could also be your hormones. It could also be, someone's beautiful Instagram post where they're in Bali, right? Fuck that bitch. Or it could be something that your child did or a look someone give you. So basically anything that elicits an emotional or behavioral response.
Yeah, girl, I know me some triggers. I've got me some triggers.
Especially this type of week, right?
Yeah, this type of week's been a weird week, quite a triggering week. And so this is the perfect topic for today.
Yeah. And before we even dive into it, it's funny. Every time that I discuss this word trigger, and I mentioned this to you before, I feel like I have to give a disclaimer. We're using this in the very broad sense. So please don't send in hate mail about how we are minimizing PTSD. Of course not. With certain organic issues or psychological disorders, a trigger is going to be used in a much more concrete, discrete way. Like when an alcoholic is around people who are drinking, that's a trigger. But for the normative, vast bell curve of humanity, triggers applies to everything, all day, every day. So
yeah, that's where we're going to be diving in. That's the context
that we're using it from. We'll save the philosophical conversation for another day.
Yeah. I'm glad that you outlined that because I know that some people have been curious or offended or hazy on what it actually is. And I definitely think, as you said, there are different scenarios and different layers, right? Different layers of triggers, different stories around them, different types. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you outlined that.
Yeah, because just like trauma can be big T trauma, grief, loss, rape, that type of thing. We also have little T traumas on the daily, like, hi, Berkeley.
Happy.
I love it. Just like we have big T traumas in life, divorce, death, rape, all sorts of horrible things, war, famine. We also have mini T traumas that happen to us way more frequently. And then within those, to me, we have these triggers. And you are triggered. Your body can't help but be triggered second by second.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm hearing your voice. That triggers a chemical response in my brain.
Right. And then we attach meaning. We attach stories. We attach, which then further, ignite the emotion. And it's this big cycle that is kind of never ending.
Yes. I love that you're already diving into it's the meaning that we attach to the stimuli that becomes the issue. Mm-hmm. not so much that, that chick's Instagram post or the look that my lover gave me or didn't give me.
Yeah. I struggled with this a lot in the beginning of my business, especially because, I predominantly used Facebook to build my business in the beginning. And I noticed that you're essentially swimming in a sea of triggers. Yes. And I would be really reactive, right? Like, the fuck does she have that I don't have? Man, all that stuff. And it became so much and so overbearing, especially when I was a young pup in the entrepreneurial world, that I started having to look a little deeper. Like, what is this? What's going on? How can I avoid this? How can I get away from this?
Yes. So I think one of the first triggers we're talking about then is that comparisonitis. Mm-hmm. And that instantly brings me back to Adlerian theory, named after Alfred Adler, who was around the same time as Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And they actually even collaborated at times until Adler rejected his mentor's emphasis on sex because he felt like personality difficulties, those struggles, those triggers for us are rooted in a feeling of inferiority, which for Adler comes from restrictions imposed upon an individual's need for self-assertion. And so I find it fascinating listening to you and also knowing where comparisonitis pops up for me. It's that comparison game of, am I just as good? Are people going to see my worth and value? The what does she have that I don't? And if we're not careful, that meaning can drive us into feeling inferior.
Right. And I think it also outlines a place that we already do feel inferior. I think it's the mirror to what am I not looking at in myself? When we look at, somebody that we compare ourselves to, it's this essence of I don't have, or I am not, right? I don't have enough. I don't have enough knowledge. I don't have enough beauty. I don't have enough friends. I don't have enough this, or I am not enough. I am not smart. I am not whatever it is. And so we can easily pit that on the other person, like, fuck her. When in reality, it's always mirroring some belief that we have about ourselves that gets, like the trigger, as I've understood it in my own life, becomes the salt in the wound that I'm just not looking at.
So good. Because, according to this theory, we all have that sense of inferiority at times, right? You can't be good at everything.
Right.
And so by the time you're our age, there are those wounds that are just lying just under the surface, things that we're a little bit more hesitant about. But if propelled well, it actually can spur us on towards greatness. Like, it's actually healthy to have a decent dose of wanting to strive to be better. So if used properly, even that inferiority, that salt in that wound, I love it, can be like, what's there? And what do I want to do with it? And how can I use this in my own authentic way? Right? Because you can't be her. You don't want to be. There's Beyonce.
Right.
How can
We've all got a little Beyonce in us.
I do. How can I use this to heal that wound, to compensate now in a correct way?
I'm curious, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of, the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it talks a lot about fixed mindset and growth mindset. And I see that kind of coming in this, right? So you're saying there's a healthy way, there's a healthy aspect to wanting to better ourselves, right? And you can use that as fuel. And I remember reading Mindset maybe 6 months ago or so, and recognizing that, Carol Dweck said there are often people fall into two camps. Those who feel that they're fixed, they cannot change themselves. Even if they logically think that they can change themselves, there's something within them that acts like things are fixed, that thinks their worth is fixed, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas there's also people who look at those things, comparisonitis triggers, failing, and uses that, their story, their mindset around that is, sweet, I can become better, I can become more knowledgeable, I can become more well-versed in this, more well-versed in that. She's got happiness. What can I do to make myself happy, right? And I think that's where, there's really like dark, almost unhealthy fixation on it when you feel like you're fixed in what you are or have. And there's this ability for growth and expansion in this idea of, I can use this to my advantage.
Yeah, it's a huge difference from why me to challenge accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I love that you said, for me, when you were talking, you brought up the question of, what is it about her? What is it about what she's doing? If you can unpack the thing that we're craving, that we're feeling frustrated over, it makes it so much more easy to decide what we want to do with it. Is it that she's traveling? Do you want to travel? And then what do you have to do to make that happen, right? Or is it that she's hit a certain income point? If so, why do you want that income point? What would that give you?
Right.
How do you get there?
Right.
Rather than just sitting there scrolling with your bottle of vodka crying at her Instagram feed.
Totally. And I think there's another side to it as well. I think triggers do a couple of things. Number one, they show you where your desires are, right? So if you feel jealous or comparative with somebody else, it may be just as you're stating, well, why do I want what she has? And do I even want what she has, right? And allowing that desire in you. And allowing yourself to recognize I really want to be traveling, and I don't let myself think that a lot. And I don't let myself believe that that's possible for me, right? So I think on one hand, it really outlines desire. On the other hand, I think it also, in some aspect, certain triggers, right? Let's say somebody posts something about I am such a great coach and I'm blah, 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 and I'm stepping into my power. And you go, ugh, shut up. I think, right? I think there's also a part of triggers that reflect.
Were you in my head this week, Alex?
I think there's also a part of triggers that reflect back a shadow part of ourselves or an unexpressed part of ourselves.
Yes. So you and Adler would have been best buds, because that's exactly what he proposes. It's how can you compensate in a different, I don't like that word, but it's how are you going to assert your autonomy and your independence?
Right.
What's not being birthed in you?
Right. Right. And I think when you look at triggers as this constant communication with yourself and universe, God, whatever you believe in, this is a map. This is a reflection of where I can birth something, where I can allow something, where I can release something, where I can express something, because triggers are always pointing to something in us, whether that's a belief that we have, that we hold, that we need to let go of, or a desire that we have, that we hold, that we need to allow.
Yes, it's emotional feedback. Come on.
Yeah.
It's your body talking to you. It's so good. So I want to really tease apart, though, before we move forward, it's almost hard to describe, but how to do that in a healthy way, because with triggers often comes toxicity. And so how do our listeners know whether this is just something healthy in them that needs to be approached, right? It's spirit talking to them, their body talking to them, something that is helpful for their growth, or if they are just in a toxic relationship or in a bad environment. Like, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, how do we help them tease apart?
I'm actually really curious as to what you think about that, because I don't know if you already have an opinion, but I've always been verbose and expressive. And so I've always kind of pulled towards me this small group of people with whom I can express anything, and they still think I shit gold. They still love me enough, but they can see the darker sides of me, the jealous sides of me, the frustrated sides of me. And I have tended to use support of others to help reflect back to me, is this just my ego? Is this really unhealthy? What's going on? But I would be really curious as to what you think in terms of what people can do or how they can differentiate, maybe if they don't have that support or if they don't hire somebody.
My fear is actually more if they have hired somebody or are surrounded by a quote unquote support system that's actually not a healthy mirror for them.
Ooh, curveball, love it.
So,
yeah, good point.
Because when you are triggered, you're automatically second guessing yourself and you're in a very vulnerable state. And it can either go very well, like we're talking about with Alfred Adler and, that consciousness piece, but that's assuming that I'm in a healthy enough state or that I have a healthy enough support system to help me do that inner work and say, oh, where is this soft, tender spot? And how can I further heal it or work on it or assert it, etc. Yes. What happens when I see, clients come in and they're like, well, I was just triggered. And to me, they're falling on their own sword or somebody else's sword, right? Say somebody else or the thing that's triggering them is a toxic relationship.
Right.
And so they're trying so hard to do that inner work, which may be learning how not to be codependent, learning assertiveness behaviors, maybe relearning core conditioned beliefs that actually got them in the relationship in the first place. And maybe that relationship gets to stay, but that's only if the other person is also working on their shadow.
Right.
Perhaps. So my fear and what I want to dive into further is, how do listeners know if it's not them? Like, what happens when say somebody broke your arm, right? Could have been an accident, complete accident, and you get it put in a cast and it's starting to heal, and then the person hits it again and again and again and again. And they come in to coaching or therapy and they're like, I'm being triggered. Well, yeah, that person's fucking hitting your arm. Like, that hurts.
Right.
This is not you just being triggered. This is no longer good for you. And so it's important to first take a look at the trigger, like you and I said, and dive into that consciousness work and the shadow work. But then once you're in that state of being grounded once more, taking a look at, now what about whatever was triggering me? Right. So it's not, to me, just about doing the internal work. I think it's also about taking a look at your external circumstances and seeing if there needs to be some adjustment.
That's a great point, because I think, what a good thing to remember is we're also always dealing with people who are always being triggered, right? And so it can become this hazy cycle of, wait, am I being triggered, or are you being completely irresponsible with my, with supporting me, or, if we're talking about the case of a coach client. And that's a really, really, really great point. And one thing that kept coming up for me, so I mentioned, and I've been very lucky. I've had really phenomenal support systems, both paid and Dre, my partner. And I haven't really experienced a situation in which the person I was going to for support with my triggers ended up reflecting back on me, right? Or really, really triggering me. And what kept coming up for me was really developing some element of trust in yourself, regardless of who you go to. But then that begs the question, how and where do you start?
That's very important.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, adding on to it, when you learn to trust yourself, you can start to pay attention to things like, how often is this happening? Was this person just having a bad day? Because it can also be friends. Like, how many of us have had to slowly or even radically pull away from people? Or spiritual systems, like, how do you know when the church you're attending is now past the point of just triggering some healthy stuff in you and it's actually becoming toxic or cult-like? Like, this has such wide ramifications. And I think it's really important to trust yourself enough to put boundaries up sometimes and walk away.
Absolutely. And I think gaining an awareness enough to notice patterns as well. You know, I think part of trusting yourself is looking at your life and looking at like what is actually happening and what is my opinion of that? And where is that opinion coming from? And does this feel healthy? Does this make me expand or make me shrink? Does this make me flourish or does this make me want to crawl into a hole? You know, if you're talking about relationships or in a church or whatever. And so kind of gaining a larger awareness of, you know, like you said, is it happening repeatedly? Is something happening repeatedly? And if so, is that either a message you're not getting, or are you in a bad relationship, or, you know, a relationship that might be bad for you, or a dangerous religious experience, or a negative coach-client experience or relationship? And
yes. So something I often point clients to is, all right, you're not quite sure if it's you or someone else. Start taking notes, maybe even on your phone, of how often you're triggered and where is this happening? Because for the vast majority of us, there's a different settings, different behaviors type phenomenon that goes on. That's just social psych 101. And you'll quickly start to notice, oh, well, when I'm around anybody else except this person, I'm my natural, authentic self. But when this person comes around, I start to feel triggered. And even though, sure, I could continue working on being motherfucking Teresa,
right?
Perhaps removing this thorn from my flesh could also be an easier solution while I'm still working on becoming motherfucking Teresa.
Yeah. I think that's a great point too, because, you know, I've gone through periods of time where I've said to myself, like, shouldn't I be dealing with this? Shouldn't I be dealing with this? Shouldn't I be, you know, taking the spiritual route and and looking at this and journaling on this and tapping on this and blah, you know, and at some point it's like, well, I could just fucking remove it and go create other things, right? Go expand, go be, instead of focusing on how to overcome. And I think there's definitely things that we, should be reflecting on, looking at. There are also times when we should be removing something that just takes up and drains so much of us.
Yes, it really reminds me of those women in the Industrial Revolution who I think it was during World War I, who were paid to dip little tiny paintbrushes in radium and paint the dials of watches with it so that our soldiers could see in the dark, could tell what time it was. But in order to do that, they had to keep the paintbrush wet. So they had to dip it in their mouth between their lips, right? To wet it. Every time they did that, they were, we now know, like horror stories. So within months, their jaws were literally falling off. Like, these women were left without faces. It's interesting. There's a book and a documentary about it. But the gaslighting that took effect, because the manufacturers were like, no, it's completely safe. And so these women just continued on showing up to work with their faces like pulled together with bandages, continuing to dip the paintbrush in the radium. And it was a huge, long legal battle before anyone would ever would believe that it was coming from this product. And my point being is, a lot of times I feel like I sit with men and women who are like, their face is falling off and they can't figure out why. And they're trying so hard to, well, maybe if I just tie this bandage tighter, maybe I'll just put a little more concealer on it so that I can stay in this relationship. It must be me. It must be me. And like, no, literally your insides are coming out. Like,
well, and also when they're also getting the message back, it is you, it is you, it is you, right? Like you mentioned something about gaslighting.
Which is what the company was saying.
Right. When people, I'm sure, come to you or are triggered or whatever, and they're thinking, this is me, I've got to fix this. And for lack of a better metaphor, their faces are falling off, and what then when they go home or they go back to their coach or whoever is providing that gaslighting, right? This is you, this is you, this is you. Mm-hmm. Because that can be an incredibly dangerous and warped message and feedback loop.
Which is why I think it's important to start looking at the numbers and the areas of the settings. Where are you triggered? Because, honey and girl, if it were you, you'd be having the situation in multiple settings.
Right.
And
that's a really good. Can you say that again? That's a really good. That's a really, really good differentiation, I guess, for people who are listening.
Right. If it is you and this trigger is coming from an undeveloped part of your psyche or personality, it will show up in other areas as well, not just with this one person or this one relationship. And conversely, you can start to look around at how they interact with other people. Are other people appearing to be triggered or upset or put off by this person?
Yeah, that's really, it's a great point.
In the case of that documentary, eventually when there were enough people showing up with tumors and cancers and their face falling off, it was very difficult for that gaslighting to stay in effect.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Damn, they tried. They really did.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, I think we can all see that in our lives, right? Like, I've noticed certain relationship patterns coming up, but it's with different people. Right? It's like the same pattern with different people, or the same this with different people, or the same that with different coaches or whatever. That then is what you're saying is coming from me and my psyche, triggering me, right? The meaning that I'm putting to it. Whereas if I keep feeling triggered by this specific person and I've looked at it and I've this and I've that, and then I also notice other people are like, no, she did that to me too.
Yeah.
Then there's a difference in saying, okay, it may not be about me because this isn't happening in other situations. This isn't reflecting itself in other relationships. This has not gone on in my life. And other people are also experiencing this. That's a really, really great way to kind of separate the two.
I think so. So I want to actually go back to one of my favorite Alexander Cavucci quotes, though, which I know you've got so many good quotes, which is that comparisonitis ends where service begins. So good, Love Muffin. So good.
Thank you. So I know I hear it. I'm like, yeah, girl.
Whoever said that was a
nice job.
So when we're talking about this first trigger of comparisonitis, one of the most healing things for me to do is to go back to my authenticity, like we're talking about with Alfred Adler, and what do I want to naturally birth into this planet, etc. And just seeking to do that for one person, just one person. How can I be of service today? Yeah. How can I use my innate divine gifts to make one person's life a little bit better today? And it really, dissolves that jealousy and comparisonitis like nothing I've ever experienced.
Yeah, and I think it also, builds that muscle. I've gone through periods of time where I've felt jealous or I've been comparing myself, and I take it out on myself, right? I'm like, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm terrible. I'm not a good person, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'm a 4 in the Enneagram. So we hold on to a lot of shame and turn things around on ourselves a lot. And I've noticed that you can stay in that loop easily. Anybody can go into that loop of like, oh God, this means I'm a bad person, right? Letting the ego claim that you are bad or you are this, when really you're just listening to the ego at the time. And that can be dissolved, and you can create space and air in the room when you go serve, when you go give, when you go turn it around in some way, even on a small level, right? And it can be a really great reminder and a really great muscle to build to focus on that and transition into that.
Yeah, it's so beautiful because it's one of the most common interventions from Buddhist psychology for depression and anxiety. So get out of your fucking head and go volunteer somewhere. Go be a mentor. Go plant a garden for your community. It has a twofold purpose. It reconnects us with our own divine purpose and connection to that feeling of what we are doing. And it helps us be other focused. So it takes us out of that comparisonitis loop.
Yeah.
So beautiful. And so now that we're talking about Enneagrams, me being the type 7, the cheerleader of the squad, head cheerleader though, no hollaback girls here. My shadow side is always about, a fear of missing out. And so when I get caught up in comparisonitis, I am really prone to struggle to not copy and feel like I have to do it the way she is. Because I want what she has. And that's the way that it tends to show up in that snake-like version of my psyche. And I can become paralyzed and easily forget that connection to my own authenticity because I'm like, oh my God, there's 40 other people trying to also be a sacred healer coach,
Yeah.
In the social circle.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. And, I thought about that in the way of, recently I was thinking, there are tons of women in the world. Just women, right? And tons of amazing, worthy, valuable, incredible, beautiful women. Yet I have only fallen in love with a few. And so whenever I feel that way of like, there's so many other people doing what I'm doing, I always go to, but there's also so many potential people that I could love, but I've loved a few. And why is that? And it always goes deeper than the surface, right? Deeper than, in our case, as coaches, the information. It goes deeper than the words that we are saying, I believe, into the energy of what we bring. And so, I've been in that place as well. Like, there's so many people doing this, damn it. And, and I remember, and I try to remind myself, but there's the same thing that made me fall in love with certain people is going to be what makes other people fall in love with me, and not the other coach saying this thing or not the other coach saying the same thing. Because, if you want to look at it from a certain sense, maybe we're meant to be together, right? Me and this person in my tribe, me and this client, we're meant to be together for this moment in time. And, that is what it is. And it has nothing to do with the information that I'm sharing, but the energy with which I'm sharing it, the stories which I have shared of my own. And so that's always been something that kind of, I remind myself, there's so many worthy, amazing, beautiful, gorgeous, sexy women. What is it that made me fall in love with these ones? And it's inexplicable. And I think it's the same thing that shows up in business. Sometimes it's inexplicable.
Oh my God, I'm over here like fucking crying, Alex. Excuse me while I pick up myself from this puddle off the floor. That was so good. I'm good. And I'm spent. That was, I love that analogy. I've heard it, in various versions before of like, there's more than one shoe store in the mall, but the way that you brought it into that love relationship just hit all my existential feels.
I am honored to hit your existential feels.
Just dying.
And, I've heard those same expressions. Like, there's so many clothing stores or like,
right.
Whatever it is. And I couldn't relate it to me. I was like, well, I'm not a shoe. And I also couldn't, feed it to the depth of me. And the only thing that really helped me do that was looking at, the people that I've loved, I've got such a special place for, but it also doesn't mean that the other women aren't good at what they do as being women or being worthy or being sexy or being bright or being, creative, whatever it is that I fall in love with, right? It doesn't mean that other people don't have that. It means that they weren't my one at the time. And so that's always kept me out of, or kind of given me a place to go back to of whose one can I be at this time? Because it's always going to be beyond, there's a lot of people whose sense of humor I like, but maybe I haven't fallen in love with them. There's a lot of people, and I've had a lot of lovers who I'm like, you're not really that funny, right? Or damn it, I wish she was funnier. I like that, like intellectual back and forth. And yet there was something undeniable, inexplicable that drew me in. And I think that is also to remember that we, as much as we discover ourselves, there is still a part of ourselves that will be represented regardless of what we're doing or not doing or saying or not saying. There's that energy in us that calls people in and of itself. And I think that that's really, really powerful.
It is. And it's so not only healing, but also it just brings the overwhelm back down. Mm-hmm. It really, for me, as you talk, reconnects me with that sense of authenticity and the spark to connection of all that is around us. So if I'm over here showing up in the way that is naturally my ain't no hollaback girl self, and you're over there in your beautiful roomy mysticism and we're swimming in the same pond, like everyone benefits. Absolutely. It just takes the pressure off.
Absolutely. And furthermore, I've hired way more than one coach, and I've loved more than one woman. Mm-hmm. And we can fall back on the gentle reminder that, we will never be everything to anybody.
Right.
And
nor should we.
Nor should we, of course. And we will always show up where we need to be and, for whom we need to show up for. And likewise, those people show up for us too. And it kind of takes, it adds it takes away a little bit of a sense of control, but serves up quite a bit of ease. Like, oh, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. You just worry about showing up and doing what you do best, whether that is rocking the babies at home or running Fortune 500 companies.
Totally.
Or making that next Facebook Live. So
yeah.
I feel so at ease right now. I'm like, I almost don't even want to discuss another trigger, but we might have to start a series.
We may have to start a series. I would not be opposed to that. I have a feeling you and I could probably talk about things for lifetimes to come.
And people would be like, I want to hear about tree frogs. And we could say, sure. I once saw a great tree frog. I had a cool connection with the tree frog.
We could just go back and forth reading books on a podcast.
It would be lovely.
Welcome to our reading club. Yeah.
Any final thoughts for our listeners today on how to smooth over those triggers?
I think gain awareness, question everything, including yourself, and go easy on yourself. Be with yourself. Find that trust you have in yourself.
Yes. I just have to wholeheartedly say yes to that. And say for me personally, it's always about that existential journey of continuing to uncover who you really are, how you feel like you really are, actually, I should say, because people make that a much bigger question than I think it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And how do I want to show up in the world? And when you can stay in that space, then it's just so much easier to give of yourself and enjoy the magic that comes back as a result.
Yeah, I love that.
All right. Well, until next time, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Undressing the Spirit podcast. I pray you found some inspiration and titillation today. As always, I am forever grateful for 5-star reviews, comments, and subscriptions on iTunes and anywhere else you may be listening to this broadcast. Please note the information provided is not meant to convey professional, psychological, or medical advice. If you could use such services, I highly recommend seeking them out from someone you trust. To get in touch with me personally, please check out ariatherapy.com or talesfromatrapezoid.com. Until next time, everyone.